And I honestly don't think that anybody today or recently or in modern times has had more positive impact on wrestling, which is hard to find these days anyway, than Pat Patterson did. And I had no idea he was even sick. I obviously he was, almost 80. So, it's not just shocking in that term, but when I just turned on Twitter the other morning at RIP Pat Patterson, I'm like, okay. And I closed up Twitter again for the rest of the day because I've said I can't tweet about dead people anymore. It's just, to me, it's the wrong forum. There's just nothing you can say that's not just the same old thing. But anyway, Pat, the tribute video they did, all of the people that have made statements, that just skims the surface of how important Pat was to not only to the WWF, WWE, but really the effect he had on wrestling. Guys that he's coached or trained or produced or worked with or just talked to are all over the world. And some have already retired. Some are in other companies. Some are still figured in a lot in big spots in the WWE. And he was even still coming by to the NXT shows and see the young guys. He, like you said at the top of the program, so many people forget. Well, they don't forget because they never knew. He was a great wrestler, one of the best in-ring workers in the business before video and before the modern era, when people just knew him as, one of the McMahon stooges or, a guy that came out for pull-aparts or whatever, or they've read about that he's the brains behind a lot of the booking and et cetera. But Pat was a hell of a worker. And I'll be honest with you. Remember I told you that Weasel Dooley and I used to get the Madison Square Garden shows on MSG cable back in the early 80s. And we were all excited until we saw one. And then it was like, fuck, every Tuesday night at the Louisville Gardens is better than this. But Pat Patterson had, to me, the most NWA style WWF wrestling match of the modern era. The alley fight in the Garden with Sergeant Slaughter. And that was a big tape collector's classic. And we watched that over and over again. You didn't see action like that because Slaughter could work his ass off. And he'd worked many other places and was a bumping big man. And Pat had that fire. And it was like a San Francisco Cow Palace match. It was like the Bret Hart and Steve Austin I Quit match, where it just, all of a sudden you went to Starrcade, you went to old Southern wrestling, you went to real shit instead of the homogenized, pasteurized WWF stuff. It was especially, I guess, coincidental that this happened right as you and I have both been reading. We mentioned the book When It Was Big Time, the history of Northern California wrestling that Rock Rims has done. And we'll talk more about this ridiculous book. My God, it's like he's a 150-year-old vampire and actually didn't do research but witnessed all this shit. I've never seen such detail going back decades. But it talks about not only Ray Stevens being Roy Shire's first superstar in San Francisco and where the Cow Palace was the biggest drawing wrestling building in the country. They were doing 15,000, 16,000 people every show in the early 60s. And then Pat comes in and they become the Blonde Bombers. And then Pat takes over as the top guy. You realize where Pat got that mind for finishes. When I'm reading this book, the way that Rock Rims described San Francisco wrestling, it was like hearing Mid-South wrestling. Everything logical, intricate finishes. Everything had a purpose. And hearing the descriptions of Roy Shire was like hearing a description I would have given of Bill Watts 30 years ago. He yelled and cussed at everybody, hard to get along with, demanding perfectionist, a genius at wrestling. Had to manage things exactly his own way. Huge success in the territory. Heat on the heels. The baby faces were beloved. And I had almost always given Watts credit for being from the Eddie Graham camp, because Eddie Graham's another guy that influenced so many people. But I think now, because Watts spent 14 months in San Francisco working for Roy Shire in the mid-'60s, I think that was his year for me in Mid-South Wrestling in 1984. So Pat Patterson was the top guy in a major town for years, learning from a master, a genius at finishes and at psychology of matches. And then he goes on to work all over. worked in the AWA for Vern Gagne, worked in Florida for Eddie Graham, was a top name almost everywhere across the country, and finally ends up in late 70s, early 80s in the WWF, was the Intercontinental Champion, and made such an impression on Vince that he brought him in and Pat was with that accent, far from being a great announcer, but he got him out of the ring, Vince did, and focused him on the office and on his mind for creativity and finishes and the psychology and flow of matches. And he had more of an impact on the wrestling industry behind the scenes in the WWF as he had as a main event star for 20 years previously. And I remember that we were at the Cow Palace one time, and Pat was there because he was an agent, and we were running a WWF show there. And the back area, this in the 90s, it was the Cow Palace is old and disrepair even then, but you know what? I said, tell us some stories, right? And he told me the one, and it's been repeated in other places. He and Stevens, I can't remember who they were working with, but they went out and had a match for the ages in the Cow Palace, and the people were going out of their mind, and they were jumping up and down, and then Stevens and Patterson were bumping and doing all this shit and all that shit, and they come back, and Roy Shire is livid. Don't ever do that again. They said, what? We thought we had yes, you had a great match. You had a better match than anybody else can ever have, and I've got to run this town for years. You'll be gone. How do I follow it? They were that good. You know, the accent thing. Pat had, because everybody wonders about the crowd go banana and whatever. Pat was French Canadian, and he had that accent that they drop random S's. When he would talk about Ray Stevens, he'd say, "Let me tell you, Ray Steven." And it was a line that always cracked everybody up Pat was always so excited and so up when there was any reason to be. He knew when things sucked also and when it was a somber time. But after a good match, he'd have that smile on his face. He'd be joyous. The people were going banana. And that's that's the kind of thing, those pronunciations and those words and the things he would say. Pat was friendly. He would talk to anybody. I've seen him sitting in hotel lobbies, reading a newspaper and just talking to strangers that walked by, just have conversations with them. He loved people. He loved getting out. That's why he loved the karaoke. He loved singing My Way all across the world. The last couple times I saw him I saw him in New Orleans when WrestleMania was there, and I'd gone down for the Mid-South Fan Fest. And we're there the day early, and Stace and I are walking down Bourbon Street. We were going to get some broiled oysters with the Condries, and Pat walks out of the door of one of the places. Oh, hey, JC. And we talked 15 minutes down there on the street, and people were recognizing him, and he's like, hey, blah, blah, blah. And then I saw him, I think, a couple of years ago at I believe it was the Legends of the Ring Fan Fest up in New Jersey. He didn't do many of those, but I think he was doing a signing or something. And I ran into him coming out of the elevator. Hey, and he's just like, if you haven't seen him in 20 years, it was still to say, hey, JC. And I got to talk to him a little bit there. And he's like, JC, I always get a kick out of you, because he loved hearing me going back and forth with Bruce. He wasn't there for a lot of the Russo stuff. Thankfully, he wasn't around for Russo most of the time, except, he was agenting at the shows, but he wasn't in the creative meetings. We may have seen one of those fiery comebacks if he was. But he always get a kick out of you, the way you take the piss out of Bruce, and it's blah, blah, blah. I've told the story before that when I first started in the WWF, Pat was still there on creative and as an agent at the matches. But right before I started on creative and moved up there in 96, it was one of the times where he was going to retire, actually going to retire and travel, him and Louie, see some things, whatever, take it easy, still produce at TV, but he wasn't going to do creative anymore. And he was still living up in Connecticut at the time. I think later on he moved to Florida and he really did get away from creative. But every once in a while at that point, he would come over to Vince's. When we had a big pay-per-view coming up, or just, he wasn't coming with like sheets of notes and ideas and ways to book guys. He was coming, okay, what do you got? What, you need a finish. What can I do? Just ideas, and just to be there and throw things in, because he would bring shit up that, only he could. So he's there one day, and we're out at Vince's pool, and Vince has to go in and take a phone call. Well, no, I tell a lie. Vince goes in and takes a phone call. Pat's not there yet. Me and Bruce are sitting there twiddling our thumbs like we always were while Vince was on the phone inside, and Pat shows up. Where's Vince? Oh, he's on the phone. Okay, well, we sit there and we talk. We sit there and Pat starts looking at his watch. He's like, well, I came over here to do this. And the landscapers were there at the time at Vince's place. And I can't ever remember somebody tweeted the name of the landscaping company last time we talked about them, and it was right, but I can't remember it again now. But they had an Italian name of the landscaping company, but everybody doing the work was Mexican. I don't know. But Pat's getting pissed because Vince won't come back out. So the guy's running the leaf blower, that diesel gasoline-powered leaf blower. It'll blow you off a fucking ledge, right? It's so powerful. And Pat sees Vince just starting to open the door. He says, hold on. And he goes around behind the bushes. And Vince comes out and sits down, doesn't know that Pat's been there. And Pat has gone around behind the bushes and got that leaf blower from that poor landscaper, and he starts revving it up. And now Vince starts going, he's looking at his book. All right, let's go back to the pay-per-view. And you smell that diesel and the fumes. And he starts to say something else. And now it's getting louder. And finally he starts to say something else. And now the fucking leaf blower is right on the other side of the hedge by Vince's pool. He's blowing through at him. And it's starting to blow the papers off the table. And Vince is like, hey, amigo. And no answer. And blowing more paper. Hey, amigo. And finally, Vince gets up and goes around. He's going to chew this guy out. And he looks around the hedge, and there's Pat looking up at him, smiling, revving that fucking leaf blower up. And then he wasn't mad anymore because he never got mad at Pat. You couldn't get mad at Pat. Pat produced. He was an agent like Rick Rubin produces music. He doesn't go in there and write a song for you and tell you how to sing it and tell you what key to put it in and everything. Rick Rubin took Johnny Cash, who'd been modernized and Nashvilleized and sequinized, and all of the authenticity had been wrung out of him, and he stripped it down to his voice and his talent. What Pat would do is, instead of going in and telling guys what to do, he would sit down and start the conversation. And because he was always working with the main event guys, the Undertakers, the Foleys, the Austins, Rocks, top guys. And he knew that they knew themselves, but he also knew that he knew how they could do their shit in certain places at a certain speed or at the right spot or the way to take them on a ride. And he would start a conversation where all the guys were throwing in ideas and everything, and he would hear them all and he'd put them together in the right place, in the right order, and he would know where the people would pop and what you should sell longer or whatever. He would know the flow, the timing. He'd done it so long, and he'd seen it so long. And he had everybody's respect. So they would do it when he really said, yeah, this is it. You got it. Then they would do that. So he was, and he was so non-confrontational, but he got what you needed, because a lot of times the guys would come up with it. They just wouldn't know they had it until he told them. And that's what I've tried to learn from him, is when I would sit down with guys in Ring of Honor or in OVW afterwards, but especially in a place where the guys weren't all green and where there were some veterans, you talk to them, whether it's on the phone or you sit down in person or whatever, and they come up with ideas, and then you figure out a way to tell them their own shit back, but in such a way that it's put together in the right place. Does that make sense? As far as agenting or producing a match, that's the way that the good guys do it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of listeners, a lot of wrestling fans always wonder, what exactly does an agent do? And Pat, of course, being one of the best of all time.
Yeah, well, you know who's going to go over. And if Vince or whoever the boss is of that particular agent has a specific finish in mind to lead to come back with a different stipulation or whatever, but putting those, I mean, there didn't used to be an agent. There used to be a booker that gave you your finish, and the guys did their own matches. Then as the business changed, then they started using retired wrestlers or ex-wrestlers or guys who got out of the ring, and everybody now, Shane Helms is an agent. The younger generation knows that style, but Pat was always in the main events, because the main event wasn't about, they knew there was going to be match quality because of the names, but the main events were about drawing money and painting the picture and telling the story, and that's where Pat was a genius. And from learning from Roy Shire 50 years ago, or then Eddie Graham 45 years ago, and then doing it all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. But that, and the one thing I want to mention is, and a couple of people on Twitter, so, well, what about that? The whole ring boy scandal, sex scandal, the bullshit that Pat got caught up in, involving Terry Garvin and Mel Phillips and whatever else was going on with all those other announcers and ring boys and whatever. I've shit on this in the past, and I will shit on it again here. It's bullshit. And the only single reason that Pat Patterson got caught up in that controversy was because he was the other gay guy. That's it. And if talking about the tolerance that we're supposed to have these days and diversity and not being homophobic, everybody that's accused Pat Patterson of doing wrong shit and misusing his position and abusing people or anything else, that's the worst kind of homophobia, because you're just assuming because he was gay, he was involved in it too. And I admit I was not around Pat in his younger days, but he had a committed relationship for, what was he with Louis for, 30 years or whatever?
Oh, longer than that.
I don't know how long.
They got together in
decades.
Yeah, they got together in 1961 in Boston.
Okay, well, goddamn then. All right. And besides that, he wasn't that kind of guy, and he didn't need to do it. Now, Pat also, as I said, loved to joke around, have a sense of humor. Did he ever joke with somebody that maybe they were young or inexperienced, or one of these people? My cousin one time came home all fucking bent out of shape and just horrified and just scared and shaken, and told my mom, this was years ago, 40 years ago or more, a gay guy hit on me. I was like, I don't know if even women would find him attractive. But anyway, why did you say that? Well, he was talking to me. He made a weird comment. Maybe somebody didn't know how to take something that Pat said at one point, but that would be as far as it went. And I'm sorry, but I never saw anything, never heard anybody say that he had any issue with anything that Pat had done. Now, there's been guys that have been there in the past that have done shoot interviews that maybe tried to stir things up, and I ascribe that to the same thing I ascribed Tommy Rich didn't blow Jim Barnett to get the NWA title either. It was guys, because Pat was the booker and Pat was Vince's right-hand man, and if they weren't maybe as good as they thought they were, didn't go as far as they thought they should, well, it must have been Pat's fault, that type of thing. But no, he was a really good guy and friendly, and he was upbeat. And yes, the worst thing I can say about Pat Patterson is when he and Bruce Pritchard got together, they loved the ha-ha. But at least Pat could do the other shit. Pat could do the serious stuff. Pat could lay out a Royal Rumble with 30 guys in intricate fashion. Pat could come up with serious main event pay-per-view finishes with the top stars in the business that would draw money. But they both knew that Vince loved that silly shit on the underneath, and they would get together and tickle each other and come up with some shit, and unfortunately sometimes Vince would use it. I'm sure the gobbledygooker was a scene of mass chaos there when they thought of that one that day. But that's the worst thing I can say about Pat Patterson. He was a genius. He was a great wrestler. He was a wonderful guy. And as you saw on the tributes, everybody fucking loved him. They got to work with him for the last 40 years. So I don't know what more you can say.
You know, he is certainly one of the most influential people of the last 40 years in wrestling, and he excelled at everything he did. Fantastic in-ring worker. I only have seen this stuff primarily from the late 70s, early 80s. I wish I could see that stuff with him and Stevens. Imagine these two guys, both of them were excellent workers. I mean, everyone will focus on Stevens, but Patterson was, by all accounts, a natural from the beginning. I talked to Les Thatcher about it. Les Thatcher was in Boston when Pat Patterson first arrived. He worked for Tony Santos. Even then, everyone wanted to work with Pat. He was really good in the ring. And it was like that everywhere. Excellent worker. Obviously, one of the great creative minds of all time. But beyond just finishes, he came up with a lot of innovations, like the Royal Rumble. I mean, that was an amazing thing, and Vince didn't believe in it. I mean, the famous story is Vince said to Dick Ebersol, "Hey, Pat, tell him your stupid idea." And Pat said, "Well, it's not a stupid idea, and here it is." And Ebersol got it. Vince didn't get it.
Yeah, a battle royal, but just come in one at a time?
Dick Ebersol got it right away. He said that'll be great television. And then, once Vince heard Ebersol give it the okay, Vince believed in it all of a sudden. But someone who...
Well, that's the thing. And think about this. Pat had been obviously in-ring star for the WWF before Vince bought the company from his father. And then Vince Jr. segued Pat out of the ring into the announcing and started getting him involved in the office because, remember, George Scott was the booker until sometime after the first WrestleMania. And George Scott was way, way old-fashioned compared to what Vince wanted. And so he dumped George Scott. And I mean, Pat said the same thing that everybody else has said, because somebody called Pat up one time and said, hey, I heard you're booking for Vince now. There's only one booker in the WWF, and that's Vince McMahon. But he became Vince's right-hand guy and was doing a lot of Vince would have the image, and Vince would know who's going to wrestle who, and Vince would have the idea for a big show, but Pat at the time would put a lot of that stuff in place, one foot in front of the other. And he, did that not only for years, but then, as I said, when he backed up from creative, he still was there at television, and he loved it. And he did try to retire a couple times, but I don't think he was happy without being around the business and being able to help guys and seeing guys do what that he had done before and couldn't do anymore.
And you brought up the Slaughter match at MSG and how that was one of the early tape trading classics. I mean, everyone needed Dynamite Kid Tiger Mask. Everyone needed Slaughter Patterson. There were a few other matches like that.
Yeah, in those years, if you a WWF match for the really hardcore tape traders, if you wanted a WWF match, you wanted Patterson and Slaughter.
Even when I started tape trading in the early 90s, that was still a match that everyone wanted, because that wasn't one they put on their commercial tapes. It was a rare one to find.
So much blood.
Yeah, I mean, we should do a watch-along of that one, actually, one of these days.
As a matter of fact, we should do that sometime on the Drive-Thru this month in honor of Pat.
Yeah, I think that would be great, and it's a great match, but I think that's the one match that's probably out there, even though it's not him at his peak
he was in his early 40s. He was in his early 40s. At this point, he's outworking everybody else in the company.
Yeah, only guy to have 4 main events at MSG with Bob Backlund. He was the first Intercontinental Champion. He was the North American Champion before that, him and Ted DiBiase going back and forth.
That's right.
And then a lot of people focus on Slaughter. They may forget him and Mosca. That was another feud he had up there. And then he became the commentator, and then when he was off TV, you would see him every now and then as one of the agents. For a long time, the WWF had agents on TV like Jay Strongbow, Rene Goulet, Pat Patterson, but they never said who they were. It was, the officials are out there helping out. It was never, that's the legendary Pat Patterson. That's Rene Goulet. It was just officials. But he was also the referee in the ring for WrestleMania 1 because they realized when Muhammad Ali got there, they realized there's no way he can do this. So Pat ended up becoming the referee at the last moment.
Well, and Ali was outside the ring referee, and Pat Patterson was the inside the ring referee. And that was also because that way Pat could be in the ring for Mr. T in case he got lost. Because, that way Pat could, hopefully call something to get him out of a bad spot if shit went south. He was trusted. Vince loved him and trusted him, and he was a good friend to Vince. He would tell Vince when he didn't agree with shit, but at the same time he wouldn't beat Vince up with it. So Vince, and Vince knew to listen to Pat. His word carried a lot of weight. So we could go on for hours and months and years, but he was involved. He may be the last guy that was involved in the business at that level for that long, was that important, that was still around. When you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, Cowboy Bob Ellis was big in his day, but he didn't have the career Pat Patterson did.
No, and that's one of those things where I'm looking at talking to different people about his career for 605. Let's look at San Francisco, for instance. There aren't that many guys around who were there for Roy Shire, especially in the 60s. You may get a few guys from the 70s, but there aren't that many guys around. I mean, how many guys? Les Thatcher. How many guys are around that go back to Tony Santos?
Yeah.
He was one of the last guys.
And that's the thing. And I've told a story about that car ride I got to have with Ray Stevens where I drove him from Charlotte to Atlanta and got to ask him about Roy Shire in San Francisco. I wish I'd had this book that I'd have read first. I'd have had so many more questions. But, he always put Pat over. Stevens did. And they had a bird's nest on the ground out there. Stevens for 6, 7, 8 years. He was the top guy, and then he moved on, and Pat was there for probably 8 or 10. And they drew huge money. And Ray was telling me he was making, and they only worked 4 or 5 days a week in the Northern California territory at that point, and they were short trips. He was making $150,000 a year in 1961, 2, 3. Living on the, ocean in San Francisco, had a car, a beach house, a boat, and a motorcycle. It was a wonderful place to work there when they had the business going. And those two guys were over so much that when they would bring, I saw Pat would get introduced to the crowd in San Francisco, and the people would go crazy 30 years later. Anyway.
Yeah, remember, he left, him and Roy Shire had a big falling out, and he wanted to actually buy into the promotion. And between that and some other things, Pat had a big falling out, and he left, and he spent like 6 months in Florida, and he did not get along with the booker, Johnny Valentine. And then he went to the AWA for a year and a half, reunited with Stevens. And then
some of that stuff is on tape.
Yeah, some of that is.
I wonder if it's on the network yet, if they've got through that part.
I don't know how much AWA is, but then he went to work for Vince. And then in 81, the last days of Roy Shire, he brought Pat back to win the Battle Royal. And then right after that, Vern was invading San Francisco, and Patterson and Stevens worked for Vern on those shows. But the last Roy Shire Battle Royal, it was Pat Patterson making a big return in 81 after being gone for a few years to win the Battle Royal.
And by the way, that sounds like a familiar story. He wanted to buy in with Shire, but then they had a falling out because Ray Stevens told me that the plan from the start was that Barnett had sent Shire out to set him up with the sponsor for the TV, and Barnett had let Shire take Stevens because the Shire brothers were a top team for Barnett. Indianapolis was drawing, I think they did a period where they did 12,000 people, 3 shows in a 5-week period with the Shire brothers on top in 59-60. So Stevens goes out there, and because the California Athletic Commission, you couldn't be a wrestler and a promoter. The deal, according to Ray, was that that Shire was going to set it up, and Stevens was going to be the top guy, but that eventually Stevens would get a piece of it. And he says it was 1990, and he said he was still waiting for that piece of San Francisco. So that was a common thing with Roy Shire. Anyway, so we just want to say, so you're going to do a big show on Pat with a bunch of guys that knew him at various periods, and everybody's told stories, and I didn't want to do the same old stuff, but just, some memories. But I enjoyed working with, talking to, bullshitting, being around Pat Patterson during my time up there more than most people elsewise in the company. And I never had a cross word with him. You always deferred to, what he said because he was Pat Patterson, but at the same time, he wasn't bullying you to, agree with him. He threw in things that were valuable and everybody could use and was helpful. And I liked him, and I thought he was a great guy. And I always was upset, even when he was still alive, when people would lump him in. I met Terry Garvin, I think, one time in passing. I never met Mel Phillips. I don't know about those announcers or the ring boys. I never met any of them, but I knew Pat, and I always got upset when he was tied in with all the rest of that bullshit because that wasn't fair. It was because he was the other gay guy. That's all it was. Anyway, we're all gonna, we're gonna miss that kind of figure in wrestling just because of the importance that he had to the business, as we've talked about. But you've got to miss a guy like Pat, because to the last day he was just friendly and always smiling and happy and ready to get into something. That's the way I'll remember him anyway.